Millions of Americans exist bound to a cycle of incarceration. And I understand this not only statistically, but I understand it from personal experience. And the system itself is intentionally designed to keep us stuck in these loops and stuck in these cycles of being incarcerated and embodying an overall frequency that keeps creating that reality over and over and over and over and over again. Because even though they tell you it costs money, there are people that actually make money every time you get incarcerated. It's kind of like a pyramid scheme. The people at the top, these people are benefiting off of your misery and off of your likelihood of doing things that get you incarcerated. And that's why they design the system in the way it's designed, so that you keep going back to prison and you keep going back to jail, and they don't provide you the resources necessary in order to actually heal and to understand on a deeper level why you keep creating a reality where you are incarcerated. And that's fine. That is what it is. It is on you to do what you need to do to break those cycles. And in this video, I'm going to be speaking about what it is that you need to do in order to create a life that you truly desire, rather than being incarcerated over and over and over and over again. And I literally know people that are damn near 70 and they've been getting incarcerated since they were a teenager. And I'm a person that was getting incarcerated from a very young age, my teenage years, and then this moved into a lot of my adulthood as well. But the last time I was incarcerated, I decided to completely change my life, and I did, and I have never been back to jail since. I have never seen a jail cell since I decided to make that commitment to myself, where I left the version of myself that was creating that reality for myself in the past, and I moved into a completely different timeline, embodying a completely different frequency. But this took a lot of letting go of belief systems, letting go of the identity mask that I was wearing. It took a lot of deeper emotional processing, and it took me visiting some of the darkest areas of my own psyche where these wounded inner child parts of me were existing. It took me really going underneath the surface, and it took me taking ownership of my traumas. It took me taking full responsibility for my behaviors with the intention of changing those things, knowing that those mindsets and the behaviors that led me to being incarcerated were never actually who I was. So, since I was a teenager, I've been getting incarcerated. I think the first crime that I actually got caught for was something stupid. I think I stole a Red Bull from the store or something like that. And from there, the crimes I was committing got much worse. I started to involve myself with people that didn't have my best interests. I was in the streets. At some point, I was actually homeless, so kind of living from couch to couch, house to house, clothes in a bag. There were even nights where I had to sleep outside. Because of this lifestyle that I was living, I started to commit very violent crimes. These violent crimes led me to juvenile detention. At the very young age of 17 years old, I actually went to adult jail. I was incarcerated for strong-armed robbery. Me and a couple of friends of mine, we wanted to set this dude up and we wanted to rob him for drugs. It was marijuana. And of course, we thought that maybe he was going to have money on him as well. This robbery actually went bad. I almost lost my life and I got criminally charged to where I was incarcerated. I went to county jail. And then from there, I existed in this continual loop of committing crimes and getting incarcerated. I was committing very violent crimes. I was constantly existing in this survival stress. Eventually, I actually got incarcerated for a drive-by shooting. I was getting charged with multiple firearms. And actually for that, I spent 4 years in jail and in prison as well. But during this 4 years, even though I was getting in a lot of trouble inside the joint, I began to have this major shift and this major evolutionary momentum take place inside of me to where I started to view my entire reality differently. And even though when I was in a joint, I was still involved in very violent behaviors because, I was an active gang member and I was still identified with that lifestyle, right? Or I should say there were parts of me that were still identified with that lifestyle, but as well, I was starting to unblend from those different parts of me that kind of made up this gang member, hardened criminal identity that I had constructed. And that's actually partly what was manifesting the reality of being incarcerated and existing inside of these cycles. And these are actually called protector parts. These are parts of us that we develop these roles for during early childhood trauma to survive it. And these parts can actually manifest reality. So when you're thinking about like your average gang member or your average criminal or your average hardened convict, there's going to be a persona. There's going to be like this mask that we wear in order to survive. So this is a protective mechanism that we develop, usually starting from a very young age. And what happens from here is we start to create our reality from that space. And we further solidify our own inner incarceration, which actually turns into the outer or external reality of being physically incarcerated. So every single one of us that's ever been incarcerated, the incarceration started inside of us, and it started on an internal level, all rooted in early childhood trauma that causes us to create these protective adaptations, these protective identities, these protective limiting belief systems and ways of behaving, and we exist in this survival stress, and this is the overall energy that creates that reality for us. So to break these cycles, we have to reverse that effect by going back in time and connecting with the wounded parts of us that we're actually bypassing with that protective identity. We do this by identifying what that protective identity is, and then we have to consciously make an effort to let go of it. And this is also going to have to do with your friendships, people that you're connecting with that are a part of the jail, prison, and street life, and any other unhealthy connections that you may have. You identify these things, and then what you do is you let them go. Because when you're letting go of these kinds of connections and these kinds of friendships, you're also letting go of your identification with the parts of you that were never actually who you are, and the parts of you that are helping to create that reality of being incarcerated. So I want you to think of these protective parts of you as being like a dam. They kind of group together inside of your psyche, and they block you away from the suppressed trauma that's existing in your unconscious, and even on a physical body level. And this suppressed trauma has been building its charge since early childhood, and it's building its charge because you identify with personas, identity masks, belief systems, and thought patterns, as well as things that you do in your physical life and realities that you're creating. You identify with these things to shell you away from that trauma-based energetic resonance inside of you. So when you start letting go of that protective reality in your identification with those protector parts, the dam starts to dissolve. And what's going to happen is the very energy that's putting you in resonance with that kind of reality is now going to start coming to the surface. And this can be very uncomfortable, but it's coming to the surface so you can finally process it and let it go. And as you're doing this, you're raising your frequency, or we can even say you're raising your vibration to be out of resonance with continuing to create that very confining reality for you. Remember, the incarceration starts on an internal level, and these parts of you that I'm talking about that are in this very protective role, they essentially imprison your inner child in all of the heavy energies that your inner child is burdened with. So what you're doing when you're letting go of the old self in the way that I explained, you're letting go of the relationships, you're letting go of the connections to the gang life, the street life, all of that nonsense. You're unshackling your inner child, so now your inner child can come out and it can express in a healthy way. But there's going to be a lot of negative emotions that come with this, but once again, it's those negative emotions that put you in resonance with the reality that you have been existing in for so long. So you really have to start questioning yourself. Am I really this person that I promote myself to be? And newsflash, if you're in the streets, if you're in a gang, if you have that hardened convict personality, I promise you 100%, I don't care who you are, that is not who you actually are at a core foundational level. That is a protective program that you are running with, or you are running on, that you have identified with as a form of unhealthy coping to shell you away from what's really taking place on an internal level. If you're anything like me, you have been through a lot of trauma starting at a very early age. And because of this, you had this response take place within your system to where you had to adopt certain ways of living, behaviors, thought patterns, an identity mask, belief systems, and even physical unhealthy coping mechanisms in order to survive that trauma, and that's okay. But you're no longer that person. That is not the most aligned version of yourself that you can possibly be. So you have to let go of those unhealthy friendships, which is just another form of unhealthy coping. You have to let go with people that are in resonance with that old reality and are not wanting to change their life. They're probably glorifying the lifestyle like a lot of us used to do. I certainly used to do this, but you don't want to be in connection with people like that, because if you are, that means you're blended with a protective program operating in your psyche that has its own energetic resonance that's going to keep you creating these realities of being incarcerated. Even if you start making certain changes in your life and maybe you're not into the streets as much as you were, let's say, years ago, you may find yourself falling victim, even though there's no such thing as victim, but I'll use the word victim to circumstance, because even though maybe you're wanting to change, you're still in resonance with that old self enough to where you're going to create realities that can cause you to end up back in that cycle or back in jail or back in prison. Being incarcerated, how many people have you met that are like, nah, man, I'm changing my life and I'm not doing that anymore? And maybe for a couple of years, they actually changed their life. But then you find out that something horrible happens to them, or, they end up back in jail or they end up back in prison. And maybe it is some bullshit. Maybe they really did have the intention to change, and then, you know, reality just kind of catches up with them and they end up in a circumstance where they do something to end up in jail, or they get in some relationship and the person makes, claims about them and they end up in jail because of that. But for any of that to happen, the person is still in energetic resonance. So the way you release that resonance from your body and from your body of energy in general is you have to let go of everything that is in association with the old reality. The unhealthy coping mechanisms that you used to use when you were the old you have to allow yourself to let those go. Those are putting you in resonance with those cycles. The old friends that don't want to change and they don't want to evolve and they want to gangbang and they want to hurt people and they want to sell drugs and they want to use drugs and stuff like that, you have to let those people go because they will represent an energetic resonance inside of you that you're not processing if you're in resonance with being friends with those kinds of people. You have to completely die to the old reality, and I completely understand how difficult this actually is. This is not easy, and it comes with an entire healing process that is also not easy to go through. But if you're here right now, you are meant to hear this message. And I want you to know that it's going to be okay. And I want you to know that you can make it through this process. But it's time to stop using that persona, that personality, that, these unhealthy coping mechanisms and unhealthy friendships to bypass what is really going on inside. That's grief. That's pain. That's trauma. That's fear. That's anger. That's anxiety. That's a wide variety of negative emotions that you have been running away from. And I assure you, even if you start taking different physical actions, which are important, you do need to take physical action as well. But if you're doing that, but from a space of still bypassing what's happening inside, you will end up caught up in those old cycles. It's kind of like a person that stays clean from substances for a while, and they either relapse or they just swap it for something else. Maybe a person's addicted to fentanyl and they stop using that, but then they just start smoking a shit ton of weed or drinking a lot or popping pills, or, maybe they have a sex addiction, right? They're having sex with different women all the time, and, that's not really healthy, or whatever it is, right? So you want to do what you need to do for that resonance to leave your body, and this is always going to go back to the deeper emotional processing. But I guarantee if you honor this emotional process and you start healing through the traumas that had you create this protective response in your system that further created and solidified a reality where you were in these very negative cycles of being in the streets and being incarcerated, if you honor this process, you will live at some point a completely different life as a completely different version of you. And I am absolutely a testament to that being possible. And I don't know too many people that have changed their lives, at least from like my personal life and where I'm from, in the way that I have. I can actually go as far to say I don't know anyone. Everyone from my old life is either dead or they're continuing this cycle of being incarcerated. Either they did something, to where they like killed someone or something like that, and they're doing a very long time or life in prison, or they're just in and out on what we used to call the installment plan. 2 years here, 6 months there, 3 years here, 5 years, 2 years, and they're likely going to continue going through those cycles for a majority of their lives and are probably going to die in jail or in prison. And it's very, very unfortunate, but we can't change people. We can only change ourselves. And this is how you honor those changes. And this is how you go through those changes. You have to die to that old self and everything that's associated with that old version of you. And you have to process the emotions that you were using, that old version of you, and all of the different vices and all of the different unhealthy coping mechanisms that you had, and all of the different friendships that you were using to bypass. Start with doing what you were not doing before. Meaning, start by being present with your emotions. This is so important, and it is so profoundly powerful. So as you're letting go, right? So actually, let me start here. You start questioning your reality. You start feeling deeply within your being that the person that you were being, the character that you were promoting to the world, wasn't really you. Just through the power of your awareness alone, which is immensely and profoundly powerful, you will start having an ego death that gets initiated, and you will start unblending from the identity to where now you have the opportunity to not only see the difference between you and it, but to stop feeding it your life force, which is what makes it seem, or what made it seem so real to you. And you're letting go of everything that was in connection with that old identity. Now, you want to start training yourself to be present with your emotions, meaning, you're at the store, somebody triggers you, or they say something that upsets you. At some point, you want to locate that emotion in your body, and you want to realize that that emotion that you're feeling wasn't thrust upon you just by the words of that person, but it predates the entire experience that you just had with that person in the store. And you just start feeling through your emotions with much more awareness. And this is what you weren't doing all those years, where you were existing in survival stress and you were utilizing different forms of unhealthy coping in order to bypass. So you're not bypassing your emotions, you're feeling through all of your emotions with a present state of awareness. You're being congruent with your emotions in the present moment. If you feel anger, it's okay to be angry. Nurture that anger and be with the anger, knowing that it's connected to a wounded part of you. If you feel despair, anxiety, or depression, it's the same thing. Locate that emotion in your body, feel through it, and it's the feeling that actually initiates the healing, and it's the healing that puts you in an energetic resonance where you're not going to keep creating realities where you are incarcerated, where, things are happening to you to where maybe you have to do something that gets you incarcerated. Your entire external reality will shift as you shift your internal reality, and this is how you do it. You die to the protective adaptations. You feel through and you start processing your emotions. And as you're doing this, you're also healing through these different traumas that are existing in your system. And that's what those emotions are actually in connection with. And anytime you create a trigger, or anytime you create some type of conflict that serves as a trigger to bring those emotions up, you can also understand that even though you're experiencing that conflict or that trigger in the here and now, the emotion and the overall frequency was already existing inside of you, and you're actually creating the trigger to give you an opportunity to release that energy from your body, so you no longer have to exist in these negative cycles that you have existed in for your whole entire life. Years ago, I would have never even been able to dream or imagine that I would be here teaching what I'm teaching today, because I was so hell-bent on harming other people. I was abusing substances and I was completely okay with it. I didn't care about my overall well-being, and I was ready to die behind a lot of these tattoos that you see on my body. I was ready and willing to spend the rest of my life in prison. But over time, I started to change. And these internal shifts that turned into external shifts started with occult practices that I was utilizing in myself. And I started to unblend from these parts of me. I started to die to my over-identification with them. And I started to surface all of these different negative, very polarizing, heavy emotions that I was suppressing. And although I wasn't perfect or anything like that, I still had my ways to me for some time. I struggled with substance abuse and, other things for sure. But I did experience very notable changes to where even when I was still like struggling with substance abuse and wanting to reattach to the old self in different ways, I was not willing to go back to the streets and to do the same physical things that I was doing that put me in prison, that before the old self, or when I was the old self, I did not give a fuck. I was willing to harm you and put a bunch of holes in you in broad daylight if that's what it took. I was willing to rob you. I was willing to do you up, if you know what I mean. I was about it. I was a gangster for sure. But that was never who I actually was. And when I started performing these occult rituals in my cell, I certainly didn't change overnight. But as the weeks and the months went by, I started to view myself and the people around me in a completely different way. And then I took this momentum that I built over years, being in the joint, doing these different occult practices and working with spirits, and I took that home with me. And when I got home, I still had my ways about me. So I was abusing substances and I was really struggling with substance abuse. I was in a very unhealthy relationship. And there were still times where I would, in different ways, attach to the old self. But even when I was doing that, I was still making very notable progress. And I did get to the point where I let go of the substance abuse, so I'm completely clean today. I let go of the unhealthy relationship. I let go of my identification with different parts of me that were kind of the main driving forces behind me creating unhealthy relationships and behind me identifying with substance abuse as an unhealthy coping mechanism. I started to educate myself on trauma, and I started to go into a deeper healing process, which completely shifted and completely changed my life to where now I live a completely different life as a completely different person. I can't even imagine myself doing any of the things that I used to do. It's almost like it was a dream. It's almost like it was never real. It is the craziest thing to, essentially be a gangster, to be a gang member, to be a hardened criminal who didn't even know if they were going to make it to 30. And now I'm about to turn 31, feeling like I am so different that all of that must have been a dream, because I could not imagine myself being that version of myself now. And that is the definition of change and transformation. And if you're watching this video, I promise you, you can do it. You're going to be okay. So this is my message. I wanted to share this. I wanted to share a little bit of my experience, and I wanted to give you some education on how you can completely shift your reality so you're no longer living in the streets. You're no longer creating a reality where you're being incarcerated. And yeah, I think I'm going to wrap the video up here. Thank you so much for being here.